All right, so I believe we are live now. So, assalamu alaikum and good morning, according to US time. Good afternoon, good evening, if anybody is watching in other parts of the world. My name is Ermin Sinanovic. I am Executive Director of the Center for Islam in the Contemporary World at Shenandoah University in Winchester, Virginia. And we are starting our book talk series online. It is something that we do have in person, and we have lectures at Shenandoah University, but because obviously of this global pandemic that we are in right now, where everybody's switching to online. And so we are honored and grateful to have as our first guest, Dr. Martin Nguyen, who is Professor of Islamic Studies at Fairfield University in Connecticut. Welcome, Martin.
Thank you for having me.
You're most welcome. So before we start, I just want to say a thing or two about this book talk series. So we hope that this will be a series that we're going to do this on a weekly basis. This is the first time we're doing it, so we hope that everything goes well in terms of technology and that everything cooperates well. For those of you watching on YouTube, you have a live chat. So if you are experiencing any problems, please let us know. And obviously submit your questions through live chat. The Center for Islam in the Contemporary World is a nonprofit organization in the United States. We are affiliated with Shenandoah University, and you can read more about our center at www.contemporaryislam.org. That is contemporaryislam.org. So let us now turn to our book talk. The book that we are discussing today is Modern Muslim Theology that Dr. Nguyen published last year. And it is really a book, I remember when it first came out, I read it, Martin, and it really touched me because I found the book really relevant for the time that we are living. And the questions that you are wrestling in the book, I think are very important, both academically on the one hand, as well as for, I would say, people who are practicing any faith, but obviously most applicable to people who follow the religion of Islam. And so the format of our talk is going to be, first I have a few questions for you, and that may take about 20 minutes or so. And then we may have a follow-up discussion, and then we're going to start involving the audience after a while. We're going to take questions from the audience and we're going to start involving them in this conversation. The first thing that I would like to start with, Dr. Nguyen, is could you tell us a little bit about why did you write this book? What prompted you, what motivated you to write it, and how does it relate to your other intellectual pursuits and interests?
Well, thank you for the generous introduction and the opportunity to talk about the book here today. In many ways, I mean, this book is actually the second book that I published, but it is a deeply personal one, in addition to kind of an extension or a new trajectory in my scholarly work. And I would have to say it's deeply personal because I had to make a choice. My first book kind of fits the classical mold, which you would expect from a scholar of Islamic studies, right? That there's many ways in which scholars of Islam in the field of the academy can publish works. But you know, as anyone will notice when they pick up the text, it is written in a very kind of personal tone. It's written very directly because I had to choose the voice I was going to assume. And I'm writing as a Muslim. I'm writing for my Muslim community in many respects, though it's directed at a broad audience to think about what does Muslim theology look like today. There is a very kind of pointed message directed to my own community of faith. And I do believe that this work is also academic in the sense that theology, at least within Christian circles, has a space carved out for it within the Euro-American Academy. And I believe there are an increasing number of Muslims in the field who would like to do something similar to it, right? To those efforts, but from their own kind of religious positionality.
I see. So I think one question that often comes in relation to these type of conversations is, you're obviously, and you've stated this, you are a Muslim, you're somebody who feels part of the Muslim community, and at the same time, you're an academician. And oftentimes there is this discussion, how do you thread this fine line between academia on the one hand and objectivity and all the claims to objectivity and rigor that academicians apply on the one hand, and then your own personal commitments. To what extent do they overlap? To what extent do you have to keep them separate? How do you bring yourself to scholarship like this and to academic writing as a Muslim who positions himself? Obviously, anybody who reads the book sees that you position yourself as a Muslim.
Yeah, I think the first thing that I would mention is that we have to kind of problematize this category of objectivity, right? That any author, any scholar, any teacher who is conveying knowledge does so from a certain position with a history and experience and a set of presuppositions that they bring with them. So that's there. But I also think that what this work represents, this particular endeavor, is a work of Muslim theology, that it stands distinct from the various fields that constitute Islamic studies. That to do theology is to participate in constructive thought, to try to produce scholarly work that has meaning for communities of faith. And so in that respect, I do see this as a separate endeavor, something that represents a new trajectory and the type of pursuits that I'm undertaking as a professor.
Okay, thank you very much. This, I think, would be of much interest to many academicians, but also students who are pursuing that and who are always struggling and often struggling with the question of how do I position myself as a person of faith and at the same time pursuing academic career and academic writing, so to say. So in the book, you talk about the Muslim theology of engagement, and that your book is an attempt of trying to develop a Muslim theology of engagement. What do you mean by this?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, even the subtitle, right, is engaging God in the world with faith and imagination. And what I mean by engagement, right, is I'm pushing back in some senses against a more conventional understanding of what theology is for Muslims. I think too often we restrict our notion of theology to studying aqidah, to confessions of faith, to doctrinal positions, that these are the things that I need to study and memorize as points of belief. But for me, theology is much more than that. It actually requires each person, each individual of faith, each believer to actually engage with it, to actually kind of be introspective, to imagine how does this affect how I view the world, how I act in the world, my behavior. It's much more encompassing than simply a cognitive exercise. So I think maybe to help situate my understanding of theology is that theology, the way that I use it, is not a scholastic discipline. Those disciplines, ilm al-kalam and aqidah, are of course important elements of theology, but I would say that theology, and this is a definition I offer fairly early on, is our human response to revelation, to God, right? That God speaks via revelation through the Quran and through other means. He has, presented a vision of how humans should conduct their lives. And each person of faith has to figure out, how do I respond to the call that we find in scripture, that we find in the way that God works in the world? And so that requires a very deep and intimate engagement, a constant process.
Okay, thank you so much. And as a follow-up question to that, you mentioned Aqidah and the confessional aspects of faith. Somebody reading this book, and especially I think Muslims reading this book, may ask this question: where does your work fit along and across the Aqidah spectrum of the Muslims? Can it fit within an Ash'ari view, or Maturidi, or Imami, or something else? Or are you trying to create something composite or something completely independent from that? And what are the pitfalls possible? Or perhaps, if I would be maybe even more open, accusations that you could face if you were to say, well, I'm not bound by any of those traditional frameworks?
So, I mean, it's a good question, because I think it does leap to the minds of many Muslims, especially who have studied kind of the more traditional modes of theology. For my own part, I have an interest in Ash'ari theology, as well as Maturidi, and yet I think this book actually occupies a different space. It is not meant as an alternative or competition. In many ways, it is a larger framework, right, for which a person to think through what the religion of Islam means in life, that one can be whatever school of theology one may subscribe to, and yet the questions that I'm raising, I think the concepts that I'm trying to draw attention to, can still be thought through from your respective position. In many ways, I'm not trying to, I do not see this book as necessarily, here is my argument for my theology. It is, in fact, I think framed as an invitation for Muslims to more critically think about what does it mean to be a person of faith in this day and age. How is Islam relevant and vibrant and alive, given all the struggles and challenges that the world presents? So in that respect, the question of school and how this aligns with it is just it's a different category altogether.
Okay, thank you. Another aspect of this book that is fascinating is you have this chapter when you talk about modern time. And so what do you mean by that, the whole issue of time and temporality? And what are some of the main insights that the reader of the book can gain by reading about this and thinking about this topic? And what do you really mean when you talk about modern time, and how does it relate to sacred time and theology?
So this is one of the topics that I relish the most in composing. I think I've had a long fascination with how we human beings understand time, and related, intimately connected to that is our notions of life and death. That's probably why I was drawn to the study of religion. But I would say that, first, setting aside modern time for a second, bracketing it, I would say that as human beings, we experience time in many different ways, right? It's, you can be with a loved one, someone who is close to you, and that moment, that single moment you're with them can drag out. That can feel extremely intimate and long, and then at the same time, it can seem fleeting, that it's gone before we know it. Pivotal moments in our lives when we are facing tragedy or moments of celebration, like the birth of a newborn, our sense of time is relative to our experience of it. At the birth of a child, we may be struck at the weight of that moment, of how it lingers, and yet at the same time, we can look back and feel that time has flown, that newborn is now a child or grown. And so there is this sense that time is not as fixed as we tend to think of it. And so related to that then is, how have things changed in the modern era? And part of my argument is that there are different ways of understanding modern time. That in the modern world, various human societies have done a great deal to try to commodify time. I mean, we're in the age of the coronavirus, of the pandemic. And there's all these pushes for productivity, that we must make our time valuable, that we need to accomplish all these goals, despite the insanity and chaos that is around us. That, we have measured time with precision, that we have to clock our hours, we need to kind of make the most of it. And, when you think about these kind of modern notions of time, what they all have in common is that they direct our attention on time as a very this worldly experience, right? That why time matters is because of what we do in the here and now. Now, you contrast this with how religions, Islam especially, conceives of time, is that time doesn't belong to human beings. Time is God's. God created time for our benefits, that we exist in time. And that because time belongs to God, that how we spend our life ought to be oriented in line with the vision that he's laid out for us. And so that relates back to life and death, because when you think about modern time and its constant reorientation to how we live in this world, we lose sight of the fact that there is death approaching, right? That there is an afterlife to look to. And you see this also with just kind of how our society has evolved when it comes to those who are suffering at the end of life, that we don't die like we used to. We do not die surrounded in familiar settings in our homes. We don't die surrounded by our families necessarily. Increasingly, we're dying in very sterile, removed locations. That, the reality and the weightiness of death is something that we have lost track of. You can even see this in the food that we eat, right? If you think about the way that meat is produced, we no longer experience the taking of life. of the animal that we would like to consume. Instead, it's prepackaged. It's delivered to us without us witnessing the sacrifice that is made. So those are some of the points that I try to raise, to kind of highlight where we are now, that we live in the modern world and our sense of time is very different. And I'm not trying to say that we need to go back to some sort of pre-modern notion of living. I would argue that modern time is inescapable for the vast majority of us. There's no going back. What we need to do is kind of elevate our sense of divine time at the same time as negotiating the modern time we are forced to live with.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, this is such a rich field, and so many things come to my mind when you talk about the way we die. We've been hearing a lot about people who are suffering from COVID-19 and that they are often isolated. And for those of patients that actually end up in dying because of this, they die alone because their loved ones cannot be with them, obviously for their own protection. But it's also in a way encapsulates this idea of where we are as a modern society and how all of this idea of time and passage of time and death. I'm also reminded of, the well-known hadith, I think, in which, I think it's a hadith Qudsi, or it's not a hadith Qudsi, it's a hadith in which the Prophet, peace be upon him, says, let none of you curse the time. God says, let none of you curse the time, for I am time.
Yes.
Calls himself ad-dahr. So reminded me when you said, I was reminded of the hadith when you said what you said about that time is something with God, and it's for us it's more of an illusion, and how we understand it. I'm also reminded of the fact, and maybe you want to comment on this, and many Muslim societies, the time of the day was counted that the day begins at Maghrib time, at the sunset.
Yes.
And classical. I know, for instance, in Bosnia, in the capital of Sarajevo, there is this clock tower that is next to the central mosque of Sarajevo that actually still follows that time. It shows 12 o'clock at Maghrib time. It shows 12 o'clock at sunset. And what does it do to us? And I remember also reading a proposal when I was in my previous job. Somebody submitted a grant proposal on this change of time in Iran. They did something similar at the end of 19th, early 20th century, where they shifted the counting of time during the day from the starting of day at sunset to this arbitrary point, it's 12 o'clock, which really doesn't correspond to any particular natural order. 12 o'clock, midnight, is not really middle of the night for most of the year, especially if you're in temperate climate. So how do you connect your discussion to some of these changes in society?
This actually makes me think of a work by a historian by the name of Vanessa Ogle, who's really kind of tracked how there were different prevailing notions of time in different societies, particularly Muslim ones, and how that has really transitioned, changed, been compelled to change, right, based on colonialism and other factors. And so, I think this actually gels quite well with the argument that I'm making. But again, I'm thinking about the messaging here is that, it's not as if we need to rebel against modern time. There's just something intractable about it. Thinking about the example you brought up with COVID-19 and the way that we die now. I mean, I would not advocate at all to violate the medical measures that are in place to prevent infection, even if our loved ones are in their death throes, that there is wisdom in that. But it does show, right, that that we have given greater authority to kind of the concerns of this life, to how our day, our calendar is actually managed. I'd be actually interested in the shift to counting time with kind of dawn rather than sunset.
Okay, thank you. Well, I would like also to once again welcome everybody who is watching us online, and to thank you for all of your messages that you are writing in live chat. I want to take one of the questions now. One of the members of the audience is saying, excellent point, theology includes far more than doctrinal positioning. One question, how does Muslim theology differ in Muslim minority and majority contexts? How does Muslim theology differ in Muslim minority and majority contexts?
This is actually perhaps a good point to bring up kind of a caveat that I bring up in the book, that this book is entitled Modern Muslim Theology, but it wasn't written for all Muslims everywhere, in the sense that I recognize that Muslims are living in all sorts of contexts, that the context in which I'm living, right, is as a Muslim minority in the United States. And so I go to great lengths to say that, the position that I'm coming from, the questions that I'm raising is really kind of directed towards the Anglophone Muslim world, which in many ways, right, is oftentimes in kind of marginalized positions. That I think some of the concepts and questions I'm raising will be relevant across the board, of whether, regardless of the context you're in. But I also imagine that if you're living in a Muslim majority society, whether it's in Southeast Asia, whether it's in South Asia or North Africa, the Middle East, how you go about thinking through these questions may very well differ. That you will have different social resources, your community supports will be different, and the way that you articulate this will also vary based upon culture and linguistic horizon. So I imagine that modern Muslim theology will be articulated in innumerable different ways based upon the many places that Muslim communities have taken root, both in minority and majority situations.
Okay, and maybe as a follow-up to that, you do say that you write for Anglophone Muslims. However, the reality is that because English has become a global language, we now have people across the world reading works on Islam that are written in English. So would you like to comment on that? So even though it's Anglophone and maybe you're thinking more from a North American context, at the same time, it does have a very important global dimension.
I mean, that is another aspect of kind of our modern world, right? That ideas will travel, especially if couched in particular languages. I think I would actually make the argument, right, that when we think of, well, what are the languages of Islam, the Islamic languages, so to speak, we think of Arabic and Persian and Urdu and what have you. And yet I would say that languages like French and English have also become Islamic because we have Muslims who are articulating their faith in those particular languages. So, I mean, I would hope that the ideas presented here, the provocations raised here could travel because they are in English. But I also hope that as communities encounter them who are coming from different linguistic horizons, that they begin to translate this into their own kind of worldviews, into their own kind of cultural horizons. And that they begin to articulate in their own, right, parlance, what does this mean for them? What does modern Muslim theology look like?
Thank you. We also, and talking about global reach, I was just checking live chat on our YouTube, and we have somebody from Malaysia also watching, at least on live chat. There probably maybe other people too in other parts of the world. So even though we are based in North America and we are, the book that we are discussing is geared toward Anglophone public, it truly means a global reach, and that's something I think we need to keep in mind. All right, so I want to now shift to another question, another chapter of your book, which I found probably personally most fascinating in the whole book, and that is to talk about something called theology of prostration, or theology in prostration, theology of sajda, if you will. Can you elaborate on this concept and the importance of prayer, and how do you connect it, and what do you mean by this whole concept of theology of prostration?
So one of the objectives of this work was to make it accessible, to make it, to lay it out in such a way that Muslims could pick it up and gain something from it. And I think one of the key considerations I had as I composed the book was to imagine what is emblematic, what is a common experience that Muslims have, what is an essential component of being a faithful believer. And prayer is something that observant Muslims around the world share in terms of their practice of it. It is a daily experience, a reminder of what it means to be Muslim. And even for non-Muslims, right? Salah, prayer, prostration, it's iconic. It's how non-Muslims choose to represent us, right? It is, it's a prevailing image. And yet, right? For the average Muslim, prayer becomes almost routine. It becomes something that we almost take for granted. All too often, right? It's something that is performed out of muscle memory. That there are times when I think our sense of, our life of faith could be deepened by some reflection on what the symbolic meaning of prayer actually is. And so I try to, in this section of the book, Theology of Prostration, really try to unpack the different dimensions in which the faith as a whole is kind of captured in prayer itself. And I find prostration, right, is something that is somewhat almost unique to the Muslim experience of prayer. That it's something that's very humbling, right? It's something that brings us down low to the earth, which I think reflects kind of the proper posture that one should assume when before the divine, when before God. And that the way that we should be going through life, right, is in a similar fashion. And so prayer is a mode in which, we are kind of disconnected from the daily rhythm of every day. We have to carve out a special space, right, to offer the prayer. It allows us to reconnect with what's really important, with the divine, with our faith, with that particular orientation and framework. And yet prayer is not all that God asks us to do. And so this model, this microcosm, is in ways an indicator of how we should live the rest of our lives. That when we leave prayer, we should continue, in a sense, to be in prostration before God, but carrying out those other calls that God issues, right? Of pursuing faith, of being righteous, of righting wrongs, a whole host of other things. And so, I think one of the reasons one of the main kind of objectives of modern Muslim theology is kind of to bring God and revelation back into the equation. I think the secular modes of life are very good at obfuscating, of hiding away the place of the divine, of how we look at the world. And so, prayer reminds us, and let prayer then also be a model for us of how to live as Muslims in this life.
So in a way, recentering God, it reminds me of the work by the late Ismail al-Faruqi in his work at Tawheed, which is in many ways also his take on modern Muslim theology. I think he starts the book with the sentence, it goes something like, at the core of religious experience in Islam stands God. And it's sort of very obvious, but it's also sometimes it gets clouded, it gets lost in this fog of life.
Yeah. No, I mean, oftentimes I feel like the most poignant truths are always right in front of us. It's just a matter of relearning how to see them again.
Yeah, and then this theology of prostration, as you were talking, I was reminded again of another hadith, famous hadith, Ju'ila liya al-ardu masjidan wa tahura. The earth, Prophet said, the earth has been made for me the place of prostration. Masjid, of course, can be a mosque, but it literally is a place of prostration and clean. And so in a way, when we are prostrating, when we are praying, we are grounding ourselves to the same ground, to the same earth from which we had been created and to which we will return. Can you maybe comment on that as well? I think you mentioned some of that in your book too.
No, I think rightly so, that prayer is an anchor point for us. And I mean, the cover is one that I chose deliberately, right? That the orientation of prayer is also towards the Kaaba in Mecca. And there is some, yes, thank you. There's something I think to be learned from this common point around which all of us are in a sense concentric ripples issuing out of. That wherever we are called to certain things. That prayer is just kind of one of them.
Thank you. This is such a rich chapter and you bring it up again and again. So I would recommend to those who go and read the book, and I obviously highly recommend anyone to read this book, is to pay special attention to this notion. And I think it is rich philosophically. It is also rich in terms of what it means practically for a person and across religions. It's not just applicable to Islam, I would say.
Having spoken with many people who have read it, I think the last chapter, the one that is on prostration, is the one that seems to resonate the most. And while I hope people do take the time to read the entire text, if there's only one part that you read, I would encourage you then to at least read that one chapter.
That's, I fully agree with that. Let us now bring this theological conversation to something more kind of concrete and historical. You also write about Malcolm X quite extensively in the book. Why such a fascination with Malcolm, beyond what is normally, obviously, what we are all fascinated about? And what can his life tell us about Muslim theology of engagement?
Well, I think first I should just simply state that, like many Muslims and many people in general, Muslim or otherwise, Malcolm X is a figure that has been a source of inspiration, has been a voice of kind of righteous indignation against the problems of this world, someone who I have turned to continually again and again. And I feel that there's things to learn with every revisit to his legacy. But I also felt, right, in terms of my own assessment of how the Muslim community looks to Malcolm, is that it's kind of a very narrow appreciation. Oftentimes people will celebrate him without taking the time to dwell upon his words and his actions. That he's often kind of promoted almost as a token triumph without diving more deeply into what he was fighting for and how he went about doing it. I mean, there's this very typical narrative that climaxes with his trip to Mecca. And because of that, all of a sudden, he is now in the folds of the more kind of mainstream Sunni form of Islam. And I think that loses so much of what's there. And then for others, Malcolm is predominantly a political voice or a human rights activist or a revolutionary. And those things are all true. But at least as a Muslim, I could not help but read his life and his words and the model that he left behind him as actually also deeply religious, deeply grounded in faith. And so what I attempt to do in this particular book is to trace out Malcolm's life of faith, his struggle with prayer, the various transitions in terms of how he understood religion and Islam, and to show that Malcolm, in his own right, was a theologian. Now, I also want to caution that when I use the word theologian, I'm not referring to some sort of august title that requires a certain degree of expertise. I would argue that all Muslims ought to be theologians, that we all ought to be responding to God in the most deliberate and thoughtful and reflective way possible. And I think Malcolm X's life is an exemplary example of that, right? That he was in his own right prophetic, not in the sense of Nabuwah, right? He's not a prophet sent by God to deliver a new message, but he's prophetic in the sense of Sunnah. We are all asked to be prophetic, to emulate, to imitate the model of the Prophet Muhammad, as well as the example of all the other prophets, to embody that fiery spirit. And there's something that we should all learn in that respect from Malcolm, right? That here is a model, here is a person who is a paradigm for us, who really struggled himself as a person of faith, and we should all be struggling in a similar fashion.
And thank you so much. And how does that relate to the current struggles of, say, Muslims in North America and perhaps even globally? But especially, how is his struggle, how is his theology relevant for the moment that we are living?
Well, this is actually part of my next project. I'm trying to write a bit more on Malcolm because I think there's always more. Those depths cannot be plumbed sufficiently enough. But for Muslims today, there are issues that Malcolm raised that are still pressing. One is that he was a critic of empire, and we remain, right, at least those of us here in the United States, citizens or denizens of the American empire. He was struggling against white supremacy. He was struggling, right? He was fighting for the well-being and liberation of the Black community. And those problems have not gone away. And so in that respect, there's much still to gain from Malcolm, right? Because he was a person who's doing it out of a sense of righteousness, but also out of a sense of faith at the same time. I guess the key, I would argue, is that we need to take the time to understand both of those layers very well.
Thank you. I would just acknowledge that one of our members of the audience is also from Europe. So we do have, at least we know we have people on 3 continents watching us. So that's, I think, also quite satisfying. I want to read a passage from your book, and I want you to then comment on it. In the chapter on the measure of modern time, you talk about crisis, and then on page 45, you write this: crisis was not always linked with conquest and falling blades. Its arrival was sometimes more subtle and insidious, like the Black Death of the 14th century. The historian Ibn Khaldun, living in the aftermath of this devastating plague, reports the deleterious effects that it had upon those who suffered through it. And then now there is a long quote from Ibn Khaldun, and I'm going to read it. In the middle of the 8th or the 14th century, civilization both in the East and the West was visited by a destructive plague which devastated nations and caused populations to vanish. It swallowed up many of the good things of civilization and wiped them out. Civilization decreased with the decrease of mankind. Cities and buildings were laid waste, roads and way signs were obliterated, settlements and mansions became empty, dynasties and tribes grew weak. The entire inhabited world changed. It was as if the voice of existence in the world had called out for oblivion and restriction, and the world had responded to its call. God inherits the earth and all who dwell upon it. Now, reading this, it is almost as if Ibn Khaldun could be describing the exact time and the exact age and the exact moment that we are witnessing right now. So my question as a follow-up to this would be, what does a Muslim theology of engagement, which you have developed in your book and continue developing, what does it have to say about the moments like COVID-19, like the Black Death, like plague, that devastates civilizations and cities? This hasn't happened in our time yet. We don't know what the outcome of this is going to be, but we're definitely going to see a quite different world that's going to emerge out of this. So how should people of faith, how should theologians, how should scholars respond to these developments?
No, I remember as this pandemic was breaking out and being recognized at last, thinking back to that very passage, because I included it very intentionally in this chapter on time, because I think another aspect of time that we oftentimes don't appreciate is that in our modern world, we possess a great degree of historical consciousness. We can look back and see things, and yet there's also this human impulse to imagine the time that we're living in as the most dire of times. Mm-hmm. That we are in the middle of catastrophe, we're at the end of all things, that this is a devastation that is unprecedented. And my hope in pointing to Ibn Khaldun's experience of the plague, the Black Death, and I point to other kind of crisis moments, is to say that throughout human history, human beings, Muslim societies are no exception, have always imagined that their present moment, right, is crisis. Mm-hmm. And yet there's a theological point to be made here, right, is that our experience of this world, our record of human history is meant to be nothing but continuous crisis. That what it means to be in this world is to be subjected to suffering and trial and tribulation, because this world is not meant to be our final abode. There is something to look to afterwards. So how does this theology of engagement kind of interface with that? I would argue is that in times past, Muslims have faced what they thought was apocalyptic, what they thought was the ruination of all things. And yet those Muslims and those societies persevered. They continued to answer the call of revelation. They continued to adhere to their faith, and they were able to weather those various storms. I would argue we're in a similar situation, that we should not, in a sense, turn to despair, turn to hopelessness, or turn to some sort of kind of notion of an ultimate end quite yet. that we, in the midst of whatever crisis we're facing, whether it's this pandemic or global white supremacy or colonialism or what have you, we need to continue to return to faith as a resource, as a framework with which to respond, that we need to continue despite what is happening around us, to fall back to faith and righteousness, the commanding of good and the forbidding of wrong.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I would also like to remind our audience that they can ask questions on live chat. So now is a good time to ask those questions. We already took a question from the audience, but if somebody wants to read this book or had read the book, what would you like that person, the reader, to walk away with? What is kind of the biggest, largest message that you're trying to send, or that you have tried to send by writing this book?
I think ultimately, I see this book as an invitation for every person out there, every person of faith, Muslim or otherwise, to really ask, what does it mean to engage with the world and God at the same time? At least for Muslims, there are certain concepts that we oftentimes take for granted, that we don't really kind of delve too deeply into. This includes, right, God and his revelation, his speaking to us, the notion of tradition, the notion of community, the notion of the imagination, all these things. What does it mean? And I think each of us will come up with our own understanding. To be a person of faith looks very different. It may be as simple as caring for those around us, for the elderly, for those in our family who are suffering. For others, it may be taking to the streets and trying to affect change in our local communities. For others, it may be larger scale aspirations. But the point is, whatever we are driven to is deepened and furthered when we bring faith into that equation, when we actually take Islam as a framework seriously and ask the questions that ought to be asked.
Thank you. We have a question from the audience. Question is from Malaysia, actually. So Han writes, I'm interested in the interaction between modern and pre-modern Muslim theology. Could you speak about that? How does modern Muslim theology differ from classical pre-modern Muslim theology? Well,
again, it's all about how we classify things, fields. And I think what we imagine to be pre-modern Muslim theology is the content that emerges primarily, but not exclusively, out of Ilm al-Kalam and Aqidah. Of course, I would argue that theology was being done among the Filosof, amongst the sages of our spiritual traditions as well, that it was happening in many different places. But typically, right, we think of it as scholastic theology, the texts that were produced there. And while we may classify that as pre-modern Muslim theology, that theology still is important. It's still relevant, right? There is a reason that it still holds cachet, that it has significance for our scholars and for our communities. I'm not trying to denigrate it. I think it remains something that's vibrant. But then you look at kind of the primary efforts that are emerging out of Muslim communities, it's oftentimes translating these texts, that they translate these texts for us into whatever vernaculars we are participating in. But then there's another level of, or layer of translation that's necessary. Here's a classical text that was speaking to the time, speaking to that particular circumstance and the needs and situations that prevailed then. We are facing a slightly different set of circumstances. And so how does the wisdom that is found in this classical text, how can we make it accessible? How can we make it relevant to the lives of those reading it now? And so modern Muslim theology is just trying to say, do that work of translation. And maybe it's not necessarily involving the translation of texts, but articulating for ourselves, based or inspired by those texts, drawing upon that tradition, something that is going to be relevant and invigorating and formative for communities now. So again, right, it's not as if I see modern Muslim theology as I'm understanding it as the next stage of what happened before. What I'm actually arguing for, I think, happened in every previous generation, down to the beginnings of this religion, that we have always struggled to make the teachings of this faith speak to our circumstances and the crises that we face. The modern there is really just a label indicating something deeper.
So if I may follow up on this and offer a little bit, volunteer a little bit of my own thoughts and maybe ask for your follow-up on that, is that when I read classical Muslim theology, if we use that nomenclature, we often find that there is a lot of influence of the prevalent philosophies of the time. It is almost as if Muslim theologians of the past are often conversing with what they deem to be heretical sects and groups within Islam and outside of Islam, and then formulating a sort of a response that became over time considered, in case of Sunni theology, at least, sort of Sunni orthodoxy, right? It seems to me, though, that in modern times, even if I look at your book, that there is much more Quran in that. If I read you, if I read Al-Farouqi, if I read even Iqbal, I find there is much more of the recentering of the Quran, which is not necessarily what you would find in classical theological works, or at least those summarized works that became sort of statements of faith, like Al-Aqidah Tahawiyya or something like that. So would you like to comment that maybe this could be one difference, or am I maybe exaggerating here?
No, I think that this is actually something we've discerned kind of what's in the early modern and modern period, is that Muslims are increasingly turning to scripturalism, a return to the Quranic texts and the hadith and that particular well of knowledge. And I admit, right, that I'm also really trying to recenter the Quran as the word of God, right, as something that's deeply relevant. But I also look back, and this is something that I try to do, I think in chapter 6, I try to track or try to analyze from a position of historical theology, what were the concerns driving these particular scholastic endeavors, right? That the texts that were produced, the Aqidah texts and Kalam works, they were responding to crises of their own, right? The crisis was, who was part of our Muslim community? Because we had groups like the Kharijites emerging. We had kind of, there was these tense questions that were spilling over into conflict and violence. And so the question that theologians were wrestling with then is who belongs, who is a part of our community of faith, who can we count amongst us? And so you see these particular questions that really deal with identity, right? Who is a believer? Who is a Muslim?
Ahlul Qibla.
Yeah. And but, the questions that drive us and have driven past communities are always shifting, right? They're building upon what's come before, but they're growing in new directions because new crises emerge.
Okay, thank you. We have another question, and feel free not to answer it if you feel it's too, the question is of a personal nature, so.
I know the question.
I would like to know what brought you to Islam. And I think in some ways your book may be an answer to that question in a way. So even though it is very personal, and I usually wouldn't bring these type of questions, these type of conversations, it is a very personal book. And you do say that even in your prefatory remarks, you mentioned that it is a very personal book. So maybe it may not be actually out of place to maybe elaborate on this, but again, feel free not to answer if you don't want to.
No. In some ways, this book is personal, but it's also impersonal in the sense that my own story does not emerge in this text.
No, it doesn't.
But my next book, which I'm in the midst of writing, does draw upon my own family history. And so my answer at this point is wait for the next book, and you'll learn more about that.
Yeah, and that is also an interesting, position you occupy. In a way, you are at least double minority in the US context. You're an Asian, you're Vietnamese, and you're a Muslim. At least I know these two aspects of your identity. So how does that, if at all, have any bearing on your Muslim theology of engagement?
Yeah, I think this double marginality, so to speak, has kind of maybe compelled me.
Did you say double or triple?
I'm sure there's quadruple if you really look at it, but there's multiple areas of marginality here. I think all these different pressures have really kind of compelled me, perhaps more forthrightly than others, to kind of take up these questions, right? Maybe a sense of are my own concerns being addressed, right, by my community of faith, and where I feel that there is still much need, I have tried to, in a sense, articulate my own answers to these things. Yeah, I mean, I also think, I mean, being Vietnamese, I also come from a family of refugees, right? So that also kind of impacts how I look at this faith and why I'm writing what I'm writing.
Well, thank you. At the end, I would maybe leave it an open, since we don't have any more questions from the audience, and we're approaching an hour, and we said that we will do this for about an hour at most. I would like maybe to give you that last remark. What is your overall message based on the book that you would like to share with us and with your readers and potential readers? And again, here is the book. I really strongly recommend its reading. I think it raises a lot of questions. You don't have to be an academician to read it.
No.
It is written in such a way that I think is accessible to everybody. Yes, it does. It's obviously written by an academician. So it does have that academic rigor that we would expect. And I think that really is a great point of the book. So what would be your final overall sort of message or idea that you would like to share with us?
Well, I've talked a bit about this book being an invitation. I also see it as a bit of a provocation, right? I do not want people to see this book as kind of as definitive as forming a closure. Rather, it is an opening, right? I'm hoping to provoke others to respond, to kind of develop their own responses, their own counters, their own narratives of what this all means. One thing we didn't quite touch upon, but I think is also central to the book, is that we often think of theology as a highly rationalistic endeavor. And I think reason, God-given faculty that we all possess, of course, is indispensable. But as human beings, as people of faith, we have been created with much more than that. We are people of emotions, we are people of instinct and intuition, but we are also people of imagination. And I firmly believe that in order to navigate the challenges of today and the various crises and the various troubles that we face both as a society and individually, we will have to face it with faith and creativity. We will have to be imaginative. And our tradition, as deeply as it has been rationalistic, has also been deeply imaginative as well. And we should not forget that. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Now, looking back at the questions that I prepared, that question was on the list. I kind of skipped it.
Yes, I got it.
So I'm glad that you brought it back. This whole idea of imagination, I think we've lived through a few centuries of sort of primacy of reason, especially in the Western world. I think we're often seeing the limits of that, and we're seeing that many communities are turning to other modes of imagination other than just rationally based sort of approach to life, which of course is very important, but at the same time does not encompass the whole human experience. And I think your book does a good job. There is a whole chapter there on religious imagination and also connecting it to tradition and so on. And I think that's another chapter that I think many readers would find fascinating. So with that being said, I would like to thank you, Dr. Nguyen, for your wonderful presentation here and for taking the time to talk to us. I would like to take our opportunity to thank our audience for joining us and for watching and sharing and asking questions. And please stay tuned for more of this. We hope that this will be more or less a weekly event from now on, at least during this crisis when we are all confined to homes. And please stay tuned and follow us on Twitter. Check our website at contemporaryislam.org, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for future livecasts. So once again, Dr. Nguyen, thank you very much, and I wish you all the best. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.